So last video, I said that I would be doing the third book in the Ring series, Loop. But then, this book happened to me, so we're doing this instead. The Black Dahlia by James Ellroy was originally published in 1987 and got a movie adaptation in 2006. It is a historical fiction story that centers around the murder of Elizabeth Short and also the politics of policing at the time. I have a lot of feelings about this book, and if you can't tell from the way I said it happened to me just now, they aren't positive feelings. Before we get started, though, I gotta drop the content warnings. Obviously, since this book is called The Black Dahlia, it's going to deal with the murder of Elizabeth Short. So, murder and dismemberment is going to come up pretty often. Let's see what else we've got on the docket here. A lot of racism, along with a heaping helping of homophobia, some not very nice depictions of sex workers, maybe a little more rape than you would expect, just so much police brutality. There's some pedophilia, incest, animal cruelty, and much, much more. This book has it all. To go along with the warnings here, the format for this video is going to be a bit different from how I did my Ring videos. I'm not going to be reading any excerpts directly from the text, partly because I listened to it on audiobook and don't have access to the actual text, and listening back to and transcribing the bits that I would be willing to quote is more effort than this book deserves. But mostly it's because there are just so many racial slurs in this book. There are just so many. The main characters in this book are all cops, so that's to be expected. Just pretend I drop a slur once every 3 or 4 words, and you'll get the general idea of what it's like to experience this book. Alright, so I'm gonna go ahead and summarize the plot, so buckle up. Our protagonist is one Dwight Bucky Bleichert. He is a former professional boxer who became a cop after his father had a stroke. These two events are only sort of related. Because his father was a Nazi and it was World War II, Bucky had to snitch on 2 Japanese friends of his and get them sent to internment camps during the war so he could become a cop. So he's a stand-up guy. We're also introduced to Lee Blanchard, who was also a professional boxer before becoming a cop, and solved a big bank robbery, so he's basically considered a hero among all the other cops. Lee is also living with a woman he's not married to, and because this is the 40s, that is scandalous and hurting his career. So the 1943 race riots happen, and Bucky and a bunch of other cops get sent out equipped with, I can't say that word, billy clubs to, do police things. But Bucky decides, actually fuck that, and runs away when he sees all of the chaos. While he's running, he's stopped by a random man who laughs at him and tells him that another cop had just run that way. Bucky decides to go back and try to do something about the riot after all, but on his way back he's stopped by Lee, who is in the process of arresting a random Mexican man. They fight off some Marines who were involved somehow, and then they take their detainee, break into a random house, raid the liquor cabinet, and decide to wait out the riot. While they're waiting, Lee explains that the guy they're arresting is a person actor who was involved in a robbery gone wrong, and because he's Mexican and can't speak English, will likely go to the gas chamber. Lee's just like, but I guess it sucks to suck. Anyway, I'm going to get promoted soon, maybe we could be partners someday. And Bucky's like, no thanks. Anyway, see you later, shitlords, and goes home. So the riots quiet down and Lee gets promoted like he said he would, and unexpectedly the guy partnered with him decides to retire. There are rumors that people are looking either at Bucky or a guy named Vogel, who is the son of a higher-ranking police officer that's also named Vogel, and they're both called by 7 nicknames between them, so I'm just going to call them Vogel Jr. and Vogel Sr. from here on out. Bucky goes back to business as usual until one day he's called into the chief's office. Waiting for him are the district attorney and Lee with a proposal. Some sort of police budget bill is going to flop unless they drum up a lot of support for the police really, really quickly. Can you even imagine that? Anyway, the D is like, you're a boxer, Lee's a boxer, we should have you 2 box. If you win, you get a spot in warrants. And Bucky is like, yeah, okay. Bucky takes a moment to reminisce about when he was a professional boxer and how he bitched out of a fight he knew he couldn't win and then his dad had a stroke, so he joined the police force, effectively dodging the draft because World War II was still going on. So he goes out to the parking lot after the meeting and sees Lee and the woman he's living with, who's named Kay, and they talk for a while, and Kay's like, you'd be cute if you didn't have those 2 buck teeth. So Bucky starts training for the big match. He stops to visit his dad, who's had another stroke, and Bucky decides to throw the match in order to win enough money to put his father in a home. Also, while he's visiting, he kind of bitches at his dad about how everything was his fault because he refused to buy Mrs. Bleichert booze, so she drank paint thinner and went blind and killed herself. And also the whole Nazi thing. But then he's like, but you couldn't have known any better about being a Nazi. And is that really what you want to go with? Eventually he decides to sit in and watch Lee's training session, and Kay is there, and Kay comes by to talk to him, and they flirt, but it's the most tepid flirting I have ever seen in my life. I don't know if it's just the way the narrator is reading it, but these two have zero chemistry. Kay tells him to check out the newspaper stories about them because she's read newspaper stories about him, so Bucky leaves and decides to go do that thing. Bucky reads about the bank robbery that Lee solved. Kay was dating one of the robbers at the time, but claims not to know anything about the bank robbing he was doing. The papers imply that her boyfriend was forcing her to have sex for money. It also mentions that one of the reasons Lee decided to become a cop in the first place was because he had a younger sister who was murdered when they were children. The day of the big match comes along, and during the fight, Bucky scores a couple of solid hits on Lee, and he's like, wait a second, I can win! And I want to win! And then he gets laid out 2 paragraphs later. So after the fight, Bucky decides to hide out in his apartment until all of the fuss dies down. And Lee comes over and is like, are you done hiding? Because we have to go to work. And Bucky's like, wait, what? And Lee tells him that the chief had been trying to call him, all day. He got the job in warrants even though he lost. And Bucky is like, hell yeah. So he reports into the office the next day. He shows up early and hides until the other police officers head to the briefing room for some reason. I guess he's shy. So he goes into the muster room for the briefing and everybody claps. The chief gives a briefing and they introduce a homicide detective whose name I've forgotten, so I'm just going to call him Detective Nice Dad. During the briefing, they mentioned a series of break-ins, and the primary suspect for them is a known pedophile. Also, they mentioned that somebody is throwing dead cats into cemeteries, which is important, but not for another 12 hours of audiobook, so I guess just keep that one on the back burner. The briefing ends and Lee and Bucky go out to the car to begin their first day as partners. They talk about Lee's sister and why he ended up becoming a cop, and Lee decides that he's done talking about that and they need to go arrest the pedophile. Which, okay, yeah, I'm on board with that. Until. So, to find this pedophile, they decide to go to find a guy who is a known fence so that he can maybe tell them where the pedophile hangs out. So they go to the fence's house and he's not home, but his wife is. So they force their way inside, which I'm pretty sure is illegal. And when the wife doesn't tell them where her husband is, Lee threatens to shoot her dog until she talks, which is definitely illegal. So she tells them that her husband is working at this bar, and they go there. They catch the fence during his lunch break, and when he doesn't immediately tell them where the pedophile lives, Lee holds his face down in his soup until he talks, which again, fairly certain that's illegal. It's actually super uncomfortable to read. The narration mentions blood coming out of his face. It's just awful. Anyway, the fence tells them the pedophile's address, which he knows for some reason. Was that a thing in the 40s? Just knowing the addresses for people you know? I couldn't tell you where any of my coworkers live, but I digress. He's not home, so they break in and they find a bunch of troubling shit. And then they hit up a payphone to call the DMV to find out what kind of car he drives and go patrolling for that vehicle. They find him headed to an ice rink, and Lee sends Bucky in alone because he's worried he'll murder the pedophile if he goes in to do it. So he does. While arresting the pedophile's son is like, why are you arresting my dad? Stop arresting my dad. But Bucky arrests the kid's dad anyway. They go back to the station to write up their reports, and the narration makes it a point to specify that they left out the part where they broke into the pedophile's house, because that was the most egregious thing that they had done during that investigation. And Bucky calls, child services or whoever is supposed to be looking after the pedophile's kid, and finds out that his mom is coming to get him, but his mom is also a sex worker and a drug addict, so now he feels bad, but will do nothing to help this child moving forward. While Lee and Bucky are writing their report, Vogel Sr. and his partner, who has a name but I've forgotten it and he's only in 2 more scenes in this book, they go to interrogate the pedophile, and then once they're done, they stop to say hello to Bucky. Vogel Sr. doesn't like Bucky because Vogel Jr. was supposed to get the job in Warren's until Bucky snapped it up from under him. Anyway, the point of this little exchange is to point out that A, Lee and Vogel Sr. and his partner don't get along at all, and B, that Vogel Sr.'s partner had blood on his shirt after the interrogation, which makes him a worse dude than all of the other bad dudes in this story. While they're finishing up the report, Detective Nystad's partner, who had a really bad stutter back in the briefing but is speaking normally now, informs Lee that the bank robber he sent to jail is getting out on parole. Also, Bucky makes it a point to let us know that he smells alcohol on Detective Drunk, which is good and cool and nobody seems to mind. Lee invites Bucky home for dinner and they all drink champagne. I should point out that the relationship between Lee and Kay is repeatedly stated to be platonic, which is somehow more scandalous than if they were fucking. And I don't understand that, but alright. We get treated to a little montage, the first of several in this book, where we get to see how good Bucky's life is now that he's a Warren's cop and in a platonic throuple with Lee and Kay. He and Lee go to watch boxing matches, and Lee always wanders off to talk to a guy. He used to be Lee's manager or something when he was a boxer, and also he was in the mob? And then Kay made Lee quit boxing and the mafia manager guy didn't like that. But he and Lee are cool now because Lee is a cop and the mafia guy doesn't kill cops? Anyway, Lee hits him up for race horse tips now, so. Oh, and occasionally Lee will do a drug called Benzedrine to help keep him awake when they're pulling late shifts. This whole police department is such a shit show. Just fire everyone and start again. New Year's happens during the montage, and Kay and Bucky either did a smooch or almost did a smooch. I didn't write it down in my notes, and I'm not listening to the book again. The point is, Kay is super into Bucky, and Bucky is also super into Kay, but unwilling to move on it because he doesn't want to upset the throuple dynamic they have. And Kay doesn't like that because she really wants that dick, though. Also, Lee gets a phone call and Bucky thinks he sees Lee crying and it's a whole thing. The plot decides to start moving forward again, and the newspapers say that the DA is running for office. Also, there's this bad guy called Nash. He has a first name, but I forgot it. Anyway, Nash is a super bad dude. He pistol whipped an old granny to death. So the DA is like, Lee and Bucky, you have no other jobs until you catch this Nash guy. Also, they make it a point of saying that Nash likes to have sex with young black women. They really stress that more than they needed to. So Bucky and Lee just kind of drive around looking for him until Lee gets bored and pulls over to make a phone call. He comes back and it's like, good news, a buddy of mine knows what area Nash hangs out in. So they go there. And they decide to stop and frisk some randos, and that turns into a shootout because they have weed on them. So Bucky and Lee each kill 2, and the other officers are like, well, they did have a weed on them, and one of them even had a knife. I guess you had no choice but to murder these 4 people who had been minding their own business until you came over to harass them for no reason. Lee and Bucky head back to Lee's house, and Kay tries to comfort Lee, who is taking the whole thing super hard because apparently he knew one of the guys that they had killed. And Lee is like, you'll never understand, and rides out of the scene on a motorcycle. So Kay and Bucky talk for a little while, and Kay wanders off to take a shower, but she leaves the door open on purpose so Bucky can watch her, or something. I'm not sure how to explain how I feel about this romance subplot. Like I said before, it's unclear to me if the reason these characters have so little chemistry is because of the writing or because of the way it's being read to me. But if I had to guess, I think it might be the writing. I don't really have a sense of who Kay is as a person. She's a person that things have happened to and things happen around her. And sometimes she even gets to make decisions and do things, but almost never on screen. We usually hear about what she's been up to after the fact from Lee, but we'll get to that when we get there. So what you need to know about Kay is, 1, she wants to have sex with Bucky, really badly. And also, she likes books, and she went to college for 6 degrees or whatever. And she likes the nice things that Lee buys for her. Also, she gets worried about Lee when he does things like run away from home on a motorcycle, but not so worried that she'll forget how much she wants Bucky's dick, which is the most important thing about her, you see. Anyway, she shows off how naked she is in the shower, and Bucky notices some scars on her back, and that's basically all that happens there. Eventually, Lee and Bucky go back to work. They investigate a tip that they had regarding Nash that he frequents a spot where he often brings women back to do the sex with. While they're poking around, Bucky notices a bunch of police activity outside the window, so he goes to stick his nose into it, and 2.5 hours into the book named after her, Elizabeth Short's body is found. Bucky gets roped into helping canvass the area for witnesses. When he's finished, he decides to go watch the boxing match that he had planned to go see with Lee before the body was found. But Lee doesn't show up for several hours, and Bucky starts to get worried, so he heads back to the crime scene, thinking that Lee will probably still be there. When he gets there, he finds Lee all hopped up on Benzedrine and obsessing over the Short murder. The next day, Bucky finds out that he and Lee have been reassigned to help investigate the Short murder, because Lee had told, I guess, the chief, that Nash had skipped town and there was nothing more they could do about that. And Bucky's like, is that true? And Lee's like, well, it's not true as far as I know. So Bucky promises that they'll stay on the case for a week, and if nothing comes of it, he's going to ask to have them sent back to Warrens. Bucky goes to help recanvass the area, looking for possible leads or witnesses, but comes up empty. When he comes back to his car, he finds a note on the windshield that is a letter admitting him into the autopsy room. That was obviously forged by Lee, but Bucky decides to go check it out anyway. When he gets there, he meets up with Detective Nightstad, who is like, well, you're not supposed to be here. But he decides to let Bucky tag along. So the autopsy happens, and the important bits are that Elizabeth Short was tortured for 2 days before her death. She had light whip marks on her back that do not appear to be part of the torture. She had also had consensual sex at some point before she was killed, and her body was completely drained of blood before it was dumped. They all head back to the station, and now that the body had been identified, somebody needs to go interview Short's father. Detective Nystad sends Lee and Bucky snubbing Vogel Sr. and his partner, what's his name? You know, Detective Bloody Shirt. Lee and Bucky head over to Mr. Short's house, and basically immediately Lee goes to the bathroom to snort more Benzedrine, while Bucky conducts the interview with Mr. Short, who is like, fuck you, I got an alibi, and she was supposed to clean my house, but she was too busy being a slut to clean anything up, so I kicked her out. Anyway, she left to go whore it up elsewhere, and I haven't talked to her in months. And Bucky's like, okay, thank you for your time. I'm not sure what Lee decides to go do at this point, but he asks Bucky to go check in on Kay while he does more drugs, I guess? Because that bank robber is going to be let out of jail soon, and they're both worried about Kay, so Bucky is like, okay. But when he does, Kay only wants to talk about feelings and their relationship, and Bucky panics and runs away. The next day, Bucky goes into work and is just mobbed by reporters, and he's like, I don't want to deal with any of this, actually. And he demands to be taken off the case, and everyone he asks is like, no, you're going to be the protagonist of this novel, and you're going to like it. So Vogel Sr. is out sick, and Lee is not here. I don't remember if there was a reason for his not coming into work. I guess he's busy doing drugs and /or investigation stuff off screen. So Bucky gets teamed up with Detective Bloody Shirt to go talk to people who knew Short when she was alive, starting with a nice old lady landlord. Detective Bloody Shirt decides to wait in the car while Bucky talks to her because what is even the point of him being there if he can't beat somebody up? Bucky learns that Short was a nice girl who had many boyfriends. The next person he visits tells him that Short was a compulsive liar who lied all the time and was always going out every night partying. While driving to the last person they're going to talk to, Bucky starts gossiping with Detective Bloody Shirt and learns that Vogel Sr. had garnered himself a bad reputation when he worked in Vice, but isn't able to get any more information out of Detective Bloody Shirt because Detective Bloody Shirt doesn't like it when people badmouth his partner. So they get to the third place, and Detective Bloody Shirt waits outside to talk to some dudes who are just chilling on the stoop or whatever, while Bucky goes to talk to the lady inside. He learns that Short mentioned being in a movie, and she used to hang out with a girl who has at least 2 names, and I don't remember either of them. I think one of them might have started with an L. It doesn't matter. He goes to talk to that girl, but finds that the girl has run away, but conveniently left her real ID, revealing that she is a 15-year-old high school student from, Idaho or something. And the woman is like, oh no, I told her that the police were coming by to speak to her. Did I do a bad? And Bucky's like, you're fine. And the woman mentions that she saw Short, and I want to call her Lindsay, talking to a butch woman in pants, and Bucky's like, right, I'll ask her on the lesbian bars then. So he heads out, and Detective Bloody Shirt is like, I found out that Short did sex work as a side gig, and the DA wants us to keep it quiet because the investigation will look better on his resume if the Short girl wasn't a sex worker. And Bucky's like, well, I'll keep this lesbian lead to myself then, lest the DA try to suppress that one too, because it was the 40s and gay people could still get lynched back then. So Bucky goes back to the police station to write up his report, and the cops were all just being cops. Starting betting pools about whether the case would be solved and who the murderer is, and decorating with dresses that have been cut in half, just cop things. Bucky decides to go see what Lee is up to, and finds that he's just having an outright meltdown in his living room. And Bucky is like, she literally isn't worth all this trouble, she was a slut anyway. But then he's like, but I can't actually say that. So instead he goes, what would your sister think if she saw you like this? And Lee cries. So Bucky decides to just go back to work. So he goes to look into the Nash case to try and take a break from the murder he doesn't want to be investigating. But everyone he talks to is like, never heard of that guy. Why aren't you trying to solve the Dahlia case? And Bucky is like, fucking fine. And he goes to lesbian bars to ask around. But the entire time he's driving there, he's forcing himself to have sexual fantasies about lesbians. It doesn't sound like he wants to be doing it, but he's making it happen anyway. And I literally cannot relate to this. If you don't want to be having sexual fantasies, you can just not do that. You're allowed to think about other things when you're working at your job. Anyway, he settles on picturing Elizabeth Short fucking other women, and that's what does it for him. He goes to the bars, and nobody knows anything until he reaches the third one, and the bartender is like, oh yeah, they came in once or twice. I don't think they were lesbians, though. They just bummed drinks off the patrons here. And while Bucky is talking to her, another woman stands up, and Bucky notices that the woman who just left looks an awful lot like Elizabeth Short, so he decides to stalk her home, as you do. After stalking her for a while, he gets her plates and calls the DMV to look up her address and finds that she lives in a rich neighborhood. And then he just goes home, presumably to sleep, because the next day he shows up to work, and on the way in he hears a news bulletin that a suspect in the Short case had been brought in for questioning. So he hurries to the station and arrives just in time to hear the interrogation. Well, I say just in time. During the interrogation scene, the guy they're interrogating is like, but we've been through this 3 times already. And isn't it convenient that Bucky shows up just in time to hear his full story from the very beginning when the interrogation had been going on for so long? So the guy, Red, was a traveling salesperson who knew Short when she lived in San Diego? Or maybe San Francisco, I forget which. Anyway, he dated her for a while, but she didn't sleep with him for reasons. He speculates it's because she wanted to make him feel bad about himself for just being in the army band instead of being infantry or something. Because Short was obsessed with dating and/or having the babies of soldiers. There's a reason why, but we'll get there. Anyway, Red admits to driving her from wherever he lived to LA, but then he just dropped her off at a hotel and hadn't seen her since. And Detective Neistat is like, why didn't you come forward before? You know how suspicious that is, right? And he's like, yeah, but I didn't want my wife to know that I was cheating on her. Lee turns up at some point during the interrogation and he's sober for now. Actually, he says that Kay drugged him off screen so they would get some sleep, and Bucky's like, LOL, that's what you get for paying for those pre-med classes she took. And Lee's just like, yeah, she got me good. Anyway, watch this. And Detective Neistat leaves Red with Detective Drunk, who spends a few minutes screaming at him and threatening to hit him with a club. But he never actually does because Detective Neistat has a rule against that. Eventually Red breaks down and starts screaming and crying and praying, and it's a whole mess. But they decide that Red probably didn't kill her, and Detective Drunk looks like he feels really bad about himself, so I guess the narrative wants us to forgive him or something. Bucky goes to talk to Detective Neistat, and he's like, come on, I really want to go back to Warrants, though. And Detective Neistat is like, still no. and asks Bucky his thoughts on the case, and Bucky lets him know about the sex work that the DA is suppressing, but not about the lesbian lead for some reason. And then he's like, the Dahlia was a slut and probably worked in porn, and the harlot isn't worth all of this time and effort on our part. So Detective Neistat sends him out to talk to people who claim to have seen Short at some point during the days between when she arrived in LA and when her body was found. So Bucky talks to all of them, and they're all making shit up. So he goes to eat lunch at Lee's house. But Lee and Kay are having a fight on the lawn, and Kay is tossing around police files that Lee copied from work, which I guess is illegal or something. And while that does make some degree of sense, it just doesn't seem like the biggest problem Lee has right now. Lee gathers his shit and goes off to rent a hotel room to store it all in so Kay will stop being mad at him. Kay notices Bucky and is like, you talk some sense into him, and Bucky's like, I'm suppressing evidence, so I don't really have a leg to stand on here, and tells her that it's just a couple more days until the promised week is over, but Kay is dissatisfied with that answer and storms into the house. So Bucky goes back to stalking that rich lesbian who looks like Elizabeth Short. He approaches her when she's alone, and initially she assumes that he's some sort of private investigator her rich dad hired to tell her to stop going to gay bars. But Bucky is like, nah, I'm a real cop. You can talk to me privately or at the station. So she invites him into her car to talk. She introduces herself as Madeline Sprague, the daughter of a land baron out in Hollywood. She agrees to tell Bucky what she knows as long as he promises to keep it off the record, and it boils down to, yeah, I talked to her like 3 months ago and haven't heard from her since. But because she is rich and her dad is famous, she is like, I will sleep with you if you promise to keep my name out of the papers. And Bucky is like, yes, I would like to do the sex, please. And Madeline is like, cool, pick me up at 8. The next day, Lee and Bucky are stuck answering phones all day. In between calls, Lee's like, hey, want to catch a movie tonight? And Bucky's like, can't, got a date. But before Lee can press him for more details, he gets a phone call. After work, Bucky heads over to Madeline's house and she greets him at the door like, ooh, I hate to do this to you, but my dad kind of found out about you and now he wants you over for dinner. And Bucky's like, well, I guess we're doing this then. And they go inside and there's a stuffed dog. And by stuffed, I mean taxidermied, not like an adorable plush toy. Madeline tells him that it was their family dog who her father shot to celebrate making his first $1 million. He had a family friend who is named George, and I'm sure you can tell by my remembering this dude's name that he'll be important later. George stuffed the doll, and I guess Mr. Sprague just keeps in his living room to look at. Just normal rich people things, I guess. Bucky is introduced to Mrs. Sprague, who is obviously on some sort of drug, and Madeline's sister, who is an artist. So they go have this super awkward dinner that serves as backstory for the Sprague family, as well as for George, who won't be important for another 6 or 7 hours of audiobook yet. The short version is that Mr. Sprague and George used to live in Scotland, but came over to the States after the First World War. George wanted to work in movies, and Mr. Sprague tagged along and got into real estate, and then he got rich, but George got into a car accident that disfigured him, and now George is basically just Mr. Sprague's lackey. Anyway, Mr. Sprague is like, you two aren't being very good hosts at his wife and daughter, and things turned super awkward. The little sister draws vulgar pictures of Bucky and her sister doing the sex, and the drugged-up mom tells the story of the time they visited the street her husband had gotten named after her, and it was in a low-class area where sex workers were, and they all knew her husband by name, and how she got her revenge by having her daughters put on pageants, reenacting embarrassing moments from Mr. Sprague's past. And I guess I don't know what a pageant is in this context because I've only ever heard it associated with, like, beauty pageants, but apparently it was like skits or plays that they put on. Whatever. Dinner ends and Madeline and Bucky head out to a motel where they have the first of many incredibly awkward sex scenes in this book. The entire time they're doing the sex and she's all, I'm sorry about my family, and he's all, you're not fucking your family, you're fucking me. And it's just, we probably could have skipped to the pillow talk, which is where the plot starts happening again. Madeline admits that her father built a lot of houses out of subpar materials, and a few of them collapsed during the last earthquake, and Bucky's like, why are you telling me this? And Madeline's like, well, my dad likes you, so he'll probably tell you anyway if we get serious. And then she admits that she didn't tell him everything about her involvement with Elizabeth Short. Apparently she heard about a woman who looked a lot like her, so she left notes with bartenders to give her number to her look-alike before they met up, and Bucky's like, if somebody who isn't me finds out about those notes, there's nothing I can do for you. The next day, Bucky goes into work and Lee isn't around, so he gets paired up with Vogel Sr. to go pick up Linda. and for some reason Vogel Jr. tags along. I guess it's take your 20-something-year-old coworker's son to work day. On the drive out to find Linda, the Vogels think that Bucky falls asleep and talk shit about him for a little while, and Bucky pretends to be asleep in order to eavesdrop. So they reach where they think Linda's gonna be, and Bucky spots her, right away, and he catches her, and they bring her back down to the station. Detective Neistad exiles both of the Vogels from the interrogation, but Bucky is allowed to stay. The girl reveals that she was in a lesbian porn video with Short and that she has it on her person, but she isn't a lesbian, she swears. She was drugged at the time. When they ask her where it was filmed and who by, she's like, I don't know, some Mexican guy in Tijuana. She does not mention Madeline or the lesbian bars. So once Linda is put in a holding cell of some kind, wherever they store minors who ran away from home across state lines until they can figure out what to do with them. Once the child is in bed, all of the police officers gather around to watch the porn video together. I mean, that doesn't seem like something that requires the whole department to be present for, but that totally normal thing is what they're doing. Lee just gets so mad about the lesbian porn that he rushes off, and Bucky has to chase him all the way to the lesbian bar where he first spotted Madeline. He doesn't question why Lee would think to go to that one first, since it's like a 1 in 3 chance. Anyway, he tackles Lee before he causes too much trouble, and they both get yelled at by the chief. So the next day he goes to work, but he doesn't really feel like doing anything, so he goes through reports and just kinda futzes around waiting for Lee to show up, but he isn't showing up, so Bucky gets bored and horny and calls Madeline up. And she's like, Dad has guests, so you can't come over, I'll meet you at the motel. And then the DA walks up and is like, get out of here and go do police work. So Bucky goes to get laid instead. After they're done, Madeline's like, remember when I said the last thing I told you was all of my involvement with Betty? That wasn't strictly true. I also did the sex with her, just to see what it would be like to fuck someone who looked just like me. And Bucky gets mad about it again, but then they do more sex, and the entire time they do, Bucky is imagining Madeline and Short fucking, which I'm upset that I needed to know that, and I thought I would share it with all of you. So Bucky decides to finally go back to work, and on the way in, he hears on the radio about shots being fired at a grocery store, and Nash was killed in the shootout, but not before he killed another little old lady he was trying to rob. And Bucky gets super pissed and rushes off to find Lee, and when he finds him, Lee is like, I punched a wall as penance to try and explain why his hands are all bloody. But Bucky gives zero shits and just beats the hell out of him. So Bucky gets sedated and sent home. And I guess the next day Bucky is like, I should probably see if I can salvage this friendship with Lee after I kicked his ass in the bathroom at work. So he heads to Lee's house, and Kay tells him that Lee went off somewhere and Kay doesn't know where. Bucky's like, hey, that bank robber guy you guys are so afraid of is out on parole now. You want me to stay over until Lee comes back? And Kay is like, don't you come over unless you want to do the sex. And Bucky is like, I don't want to talk about this right now. Bye! And decides to try and find Lee, but he can't find Lee. So the next time Bucky is allowed to come into work, he immediately gets summoned into the chief's office and has to explain why Lee's been doing the things Lee's been doing. He politely omits the part about Lee being on drugs, and then gets told that Lee is suspended. And when Lee doesn't show up for work, Bucky calls around, but he can't find Lee, so he thinks to call the parole office to ask where that bank robber is, and the parole office is like, that guy? He fucked off to Tijuana. If he doesn't turn up in 24 hours, we'll do something about it, but I figure he just went to get laid. On the way out of the station, Bucky runs into Detective Neistad and Detective Drunk, who are just coming back from Tijuana, where they were investigating the porn lead. They're like, porn thing was a bust, our dude had an alibi for the murder. Weirdest thing, though. We saw Lee while we were down there, and Bucky is like, oh shit, so he heads down to Mexico. While he's down there, he goes to where Vogel Sr., Detective Bloody Shirt, and the DA are hanging out because they're all also there. And when Bucky walks into the room, he overhears Vogel Sr. going, well, why can't we just find a random Mexican to pin it on? And Bucky's like, hey, have you guys seen Lee? And the DA is like, first of all, fuck that guy, he's an asshole. Also, he's suspended. So Bucky tries to physically attack him. So Vogel Sr. is like, I will help you find your partner if you promise to stop trying to punch the DA. And Bucky agrees, so they go to the local police station where the bank robber guy is being held. I'm not certain why he was there in a cell, but he was, and Vogel and Bucky do some police brutality involving a bucket that was being used as a toilet. And the bank robber is like, I didn't even know Lee was down here. Yeah, I might have sworn revenge when I was put in jail, but after reading about those 4 guys the 2 of you killed, I think it would be best for me to move on with my life. But then he insults Kay, so Bucky tries to strangle him. Just like straight up attempting murder in a police station. The Mexican cops pull him off the guy, and Bucky gets knocked out somehow. Once he wakes up, Vogel Sr. is like, we had to let the bank robber go, and we had somebody tail him. But they lost him. Bad news for him, because he's dead now. And Bucky's like, did I do that? And Vogel Sr. is like, no, you didn't do a murder. So Bucky goes home. And once he gets to the police station, he gets interrogated about what the hell has been going on with Lee lately. So Bucky explains everything about how the case reminds him of his dead sister, and with the bank robber getting out of jail, blah, blah, blah. He does leave out the parts about Lee doing drugs, and for some reason, the part where Lee and Kay weren't sleeping together, I still don't understand why that is scandalous. Once that's done, he heads over to Lee's place, and Kay had also been interrogated by the police, and Kay is like, I don't want to talk to any more cops today, and kicks him out. So he heads to the hotel room where Lee was keeping all of the Dahlia investigation stuff. He looks at the Pepe Silva board and is like, damn, all this for one little whore. Crazy. And he goes to pay the rent on the room for like a month and buys a confidential ad to let Lee know that he's keeping the room for him. The next day, Bucky once again tries to resign from the Short case, but he's interrupted by Short's address book and a bunch of photographs with her and various men with their faces scratched out turn up. You see, kids, back before we had cell phones, we had to either memorize phone numbers of people we wanted to talk to on the reg, or we had to write them down in these special books. Bucky quietly gives up on ever being allowed to stop working on this case. He notices the chief and DA are talking and goes to eavesdrop, hoping he'll find out something about Lee. Instead, he just hears the DA pressuring the chief into searching for and questioning the men in the photographs a lot more publicly than he had wanted to. Then we go into a montage where Bucky continues to investigate, but more importantly, he makes sure that Madeline's name doesn't come up during the investigation. It doesn't, so he feels safe on the suppression of evidence front. But he and Kay aren't getting along because Kay wants to get into a relationship now that Lee is gone, and Bucky doesn't want to because he wants to wait until Lee comes back to talk it out between the 3 of them. And Kay doesn't like that, so Bucky goes off to have sex with Madeline instead. Bucky imagines himself having sex with Elizabeth Short while he's having sex with Madeline, and Madeline knows that he's doing it, but she's like, no, it's cool, I can literally fuck with that. Time continues to pass, and a bunch of officers get pulled off the Short case, and Bucky isn't one of them, so he storms into Detective Nystad's office like, why wasn't I on that transfer list? You know I don't want to be in this story anymore. And Detective Nystad is like, tough. And while he's pouting about that, a phone call comes in from Fort Dix because one of their soldiers had confessed to killing Elizabeth Short and he was in LA during the time of the murder, so maybe they want to go check that out. And Detective Nystad has him confirm that the guy had even met Short by having him describe her birthmarks. So Detective Drunk has the flu or something and can't go to New Jersey, so Bucky gets to go instead. So they go there and introduce the guy who has a name, I've forgotten it, but he won't shut up about how French he is. He is also super gross and I hate every scene he's in. The important part is that he and Elizabeth Short had sex sometime before she was murdered, and he took her to a doctor that he called the Roach Doctor and paid him like $10 to tell her that she was pregnant. So Bucky and Detective Nystad are basically like, he definitely met Short, but we don't think he killed her. But just in case, they send a CSI team to the hotel room where the French guy says he killed Short in, so they take a break and Bucky goes to take a nap. When he wakes up, he finds out that the DA jumped the gun in going to the press with the French guy lead, and also put Bucky's name into it, so now he looks like a fool. Because the CSI team confirmed that Short was not killed in that hotel room, and the French guy was in jail for being drunk and disorderly in another state entirely during the time of her death. As they're heading out of Fort Dix, the French guy walks up and is like, haha, I'm famous, which is the whole reason he confessed in the first place, so Bucky punches him in the face. Detective Nystad is very disappointed in his new son. Once they get home, Bucky is pulled into a private meeting with Vogel Sr. and the DA, and the DA tells him that he'll put him back on warrants, but first he needs Bucky to help Vogel Sr. interrogate 4 people who confessed to the murder and theoretically figure out which one, if any of them, killed her, and Bucky agrees to do it. So he rounds up the 4 criminals in a van and drives them to a warehouse that the police are borrowing for the investigation. Okay, so this whole part is super upsetting, so I'm going to gloss over most of it. Basically, one of the dudes is a pimp who knew Elizabeth Short and called her Liz, which nobody else in the story has done so far. He also says that he remembers Vogel Sr. from when he used to work Vice. And Vogel Sr. does a lot of police brutality. They hang up the guys on meat hooks by their wrists, and there are broken bones, and honestly, it's really upsetting to listen to. Bucky also finds it super upsetting and decides to pull the fire alarm and runs away. He runs straight to Kay's house and they have sex, which is one way to deal with this. The DA and Vogel Sr. cover up what really happened that night, and Bucky gets demoted to rounding up drunks off the street, but he doesn't like doing it, so he keeps getting low quotas and an even worse reputation. His supervisor writes him up for not using sufficient force, which he's going to come to regret, I'm sure. Bucky breaks it off with Madeline and focuses on being with Kay. Well, theoretically anyway. He still fantasizes about Elizabeth Short when he has sex with Kay, but she doesn't know and presumably wouldn't be as cool with it as Madeline is. So eventually Bucky realizes that he needs to start doing the plot again and remembers that one of the guys he was interrogating with Vogel Sr. called Short Liz, which is different from all of the other nicknames she used, which implies that he knew her in a different context than all of the other people he spoke to about her. So Bucky calls Detective Neistat and asks him to try and find the pimp's files since he had been arrested before. But Detective Neistat can't find them, and it looks like they had been taken by somebody. And Bucky assumes that he knows who, so he impersonates a person from payroll to obtain Vogel Jr.'s address. And then he goes to break into his house. He finds BDSM gear, which is really none of his business, but puts Vogel Jr. up a few spots on the list of possible suspects. So Bucky goes to break into Vogel Sr.'s house next and finds a bunch of copies of police files that Vogel Sr. shouldn't have, and guesses that Vogel Sr. is tipping off various criminals for profit. Once he's done doing crimes, Bucky heads up to the hotel to meet up with Detective Neistat. Detective Neistat does the impossible and manages to convince Bucky to be cool for like 1 second. Detective Neistat tracks down a sex worker who had been hired by Vogel Sr. to have sex with Vogel Jr. because, he couldn't just have his son be a virgin forever. So they go to interview her and she's like, I'll tell you, but I'm not testifying in court, and the instant you step out that door, I am moving away forever. So basically, when Vogel Sr. hired her, she was really afraid because Vogel Sr. has a reputation among sex workers, but since she was just dealing with his son, she figured it would probably be alright. She had met Short in the lobby of the hotel, and Short needed a little extra cash, so she set her up with Vogel Jr. for a few hours as a favor. Short finished the job and left, and that was the last time she ever saw her. Bucky presses for more information about the reputation that Vogel Sr. has, and... Okay, so apparently, while he was working Vice, Vogel Sr. caught syphilis from a sex worker he hired. So he decided to get revenge on the sex worker by forcing a bunch of sex workers who weren't her to have sex with him before getting treatment. And he also rubbed his dick in their eyes and 2 of them went blind. So having gotten the testimony that they needed, Bucky and Detective Neistat go and find Vogel Jr. and drug and kidnap him. And they bring him back to the hotel to interrogate him. They get him to admit to having sex with Elizabeth Short and having whipped her, which explains the whip marks on her back that were there from before the torture and murder. And Bucky's all, hell yes, we got him. Let's arrest him for solicitation. And Detective Neistat is like, are you sure? Because you will destroy your career by doing this. And Bucky's like, it'll be worth it. So Bucky takes Vogel Jr. down to the station. Bucky gets put on suspension while they try to figure out what to do with him after Vogel Sr. commits suicide. While he's on leave, Bucky decides to head down to Mexico to try and find Lee. While he's down in Mexico, he accidentally makes an enemy of the local police. He wanders into a boxing-themed bar, figuring Lee would probably have gone there and sees pictures of himself on the walls among other boxers. He makes friends with the owner and manages to find out that Lee had been there once but hadn't shown up back since, and he had gotten in trouble in a different bar. So he goes to that bar and ends up not learning much more than that. But on his way out, Bucky realizes that he's being followed, but he manages to lose them before getting back to the hotel he's staying at. But there's a private detective waiting for him in his room. The private detective tells him that he was hired by a Mexican woman to find Lee, so he tracked Lee down for her. Lee was later killed and buried in a sort of mass grave for foreigners. The detective thinks that they can still find all the money that Lee left behind, but Bucky is more worried about finding Lee's body. So he forces the detective to take him out to where they buried Lee and makes him help dig him back up. Bucky confirms that the body they dug out was Lee's and steals the private detective's car and runs back to town. But the local police are waiting for him and want to kill him for reasons. So Bucky grabs a random woman off the street and holds her hostage while he makes a phone call to the FBI to ask them to bail him out of this. This works, and Bucky is allowed to drive home. He goes to deliver the news to Kay, and she's like, okay, I gotta do an exposition dump at you, because you need to understand what kind of person Lee really was. Okay, so the bank robbery that Lee got famous for solving, he didn't solve. Or rather, he didn't need to solve it, because he was the one who did it. He robbed the bank and met Kay and learned what her life with her boyfriend was like, so he pinned the robbery on her boyfriend. And when he heard that he was getting out, Lee kept trying to convince his ex-manager to have that guy killed before he got out of prison, but that wasn't working. And then somebody who either worked on the robbery with him or was involved in some way came and is like, I'm going to blackmail you. Pay me money or I'll tell everyone what you did. And that person was one of the 4 guys that Lee and Bucky killed way back before they discovered Short's body. And Bucky is like, holy shit, this is a lot, and he wanders off for a bit. But the next day he decides to talk to Kay while she's at work and proposes to her in front of the whole class she's teaching. He also promises to let the Short case and what happened with Lee go. Detective Neistat and Detective Drunk come to the wedding, and Bucky decides to keep the hotel room for them so they can continue using it to investigate the Short case. There's a montage where they play at being a happy family for a while, and Bucky gets transferred to basically CSI because the chief thinks that it would be a better fit for him. A couple subplots are dropped and never mentioned again, like the DA loses his election, and I don't think he ever comes up again. And for a while things go pretty smoothly, until they don't. Bucky accidentally discovers a shit ton of cash that had been hidden in the house and asks Kay about it, and this destroys their marriage. Kay just gets, in my opinion, unreasonably upset at Bucky for asking, really basic questions, like, if Lee had all this money hidden away inside the house, where did all the money he was spending down in Mexico come from? Then he starts investigating the Short case again on his own time and imagining Kay as Elizabeth Short while they're having sex, and Kay realizes what he's doing and Kay is like, fuck you, sleep on the couch forever. So a while into the couch dwelling, Bucky gets a call to investigate the scene of a suicide that took place not too far from where the Spragues live. He ends up heading back after the scene is cleaned up to gossip with the widow, and they become friends. He sees a creepy painting that reminds him of the Short murder because it features a clown with similar wounds on the face. Bucky decides to start stalking Madeline again, as you do. He sits outside her house until one day she notices him. The next day she comes out in a black dress and goes to a bar to pick up a random soldier while, role-playing as Elizabeth Short. Life moves on and Bucky keeps working at the job he hates and living on the couch during his failing marriage. Finally, one day, he and Kay have unpleasant sex. So naturally, he starts taking Benzedrine and convinces the chief to move him back to a patrol beat. And he decides that this time he's going to beat up those minorities. He decides to go after some known troublemakers and picks fights with a bunch of them in a row. And all of the cops love him again because he's beating up the minorities like a good little tool of the state. And then one day on patrol, Bucky has a disassociative episode or something. He just attacks someone for no reason. And then he decides to call Madeline, and she's like, my parents aren't home, and he goes over to do the sex with her, and he stays there for 3 whole weeks without ever going back to his own house. When he finally does decide to head back to his house, it's just in time to see Kay moving out, because she hired a private detective to find her husband and learned of his turbo affair. So Bucky goes around and just destroys the things that Kay left behind in the house before going to stay in the hotel room he's been keeping for the Short case. And he decides, you know what this room needs? A traumatized sex worker. So he goes out and buys a cheap wig and picks up a woman who kind of reminds him of Elizabeth Short and brings her back to the room, and she's like, holy shit, this is the Black Dahlia killer, because who else would have a room full of photos and press clippings about the murder? Eventually, Bucky lets her go and decides to head to Boston to continue his investigation. He visits some of the places where Short had worked before she left for LA, and he's like, hi, I am a reporter, and both times he tries it, everyone is like, you're a fucking cop. Bucky learns from the owner of a movie theater that Short used to work at that she used to sneak into movies to describe what was happening on screen to her boyfriend who was blind. So Bucky goes to talk to the boyfriend who explains some of Short's backstory. It turns out that not long before she left for LA, she was raped, and during the attack, 2 soldiers scared her attackers off. She went to the doctor to make sure she wasn't pregnant, and the doctor told her it was impossible for her to become pregnant because of a problem with her uterus or something. But it was too late. She was already obsessed with the idea of having a child of, if not the 2 men who had saved her, then a war hero in general. So she went out to LA to try to become a movie star. Bucky heads back to LA and is like, wait a second, did we ever follow up on that roach doctor thing? And apparently nobody did. So he and Detective Neistat start looking into it, but Detective Neistat had to go take care of other business, and Bucky decides to follow up with the security guard who works on a movie set, and that guy acts as a sort of go-between for the police and the movies. And they had asked him if he knew anything about Short back when the case was still new, but he said no. And Bucky decides to go talk to him anyway. I don't remember why. To be honest, at this point the book was really testing my ability to focus. So he goes to talk to the guy, and it quickly escalates to Bucky holding him at gunpoint and threatening to shoot him if he doesn't tell Bucky what he knows. So the security guard is like, yeah, I knew something, but I looked into it and it turned out to be nothing anyway. But that's not good enough for Bucky and his gun, so the security guard tells him that Short had an audition with one of the directors or producers or something, and she also slept with him at his house, but then she got mad at him for saying she was a bad actress and walked out. And Bucky realizes that if Short had used a payphone, there would be a record of it, so he pesters phone companies for a while. Then he manages to find out that Short booked an appointment for a pregnancy test with a gynecologist, but couldn't make it because she was too busy being tortured and murdered that day. Bucky manages to track down a Dr. Roach who had lost his license for selling drugs on the side, and he's like, aha, the Roach Doctor. And Detective Neistat and Detective Drunk are busy, but Detective Neistat calls ahead to the prison Dr. Roach is at, and whatever he says gets Bucky through the door. Dr. Roach is extremely smug and has an alibi for the murder, but he does admit to having met Short when the French guy came in and paid him $10 to tell her that she was pregnant. He remembers she borrowed his phone when she was there, and she called someone whose name began with an M. Bucky thinks of Madeline, but he's like, but I really don't want it to be her, though, and he goes for a drive. So while he's out, he sees a movie poster that features some of the columns that were in the porn video that Short was in. So he goes to see the movie and confirms in the credits that it was filmed in Hollywood and not Tijuana. So he heads back to the hotel to pick up his gun because he wants to interrogate the Spriggs. But while he's there, he gets a phone call from Detective Drunk who needs him to come out with a CSI kit because he found something. So Bucky goes out to meet Detective Drunk, and they find the murder scene and the baseball bat that was used to kill Elizabeth Short. And Detective Drunk is like, you okay, buddy? Because Bucky has been way overexcited and sweating and shaking like a small dog all day. But Bucky's like, fuck you, to one of the only people left who can tolerate his bullshit, and leaves. He heads straight to the Sprague house and finds it mostly packed up and in boxes because Mr. Sprague is in a lot of trouble now that people have cottoned on to the fact that he built 90% of his houses out of plywood and hope. So Bucky sneaks through the house and finds Mr. Sprague and Madeline in bed, not being like overtly sexual, but definitely in that area. Bucky doesn't take it well and starts shooting up all the expensive artwork in the room. So Mr. Sprague comes clean about the truth about himself and George, how George saved his life back in World War I by hiding them under a pile of bodies when enemy soldiers came by. George also likes to touch dead things, and it was Mr. Sprague who disfigured George after he found out that George is Madeline's real father. And also he began having an inappropriate relationship with Madeline now that he realized they weren't blood related, and the sister was the one who sent the address book and the photos in, having scratched out the faces of men in order to try to tell the police to look for a lesbian. And George was blackmailing Mr. Sprague, and if Mr. Sprague didn't set him up with Short, then George was going to air out some dirty laundry. And Mr. Sprague didn't think that George would kill her, but he totally did. So Mr. Sprague gives Bucky George's address and is like, go get him, champ. And Bucky decides to go along with it. He goes to the abandoned house where George is living and sees that the room he claimed for himself is full of, pickled organs and such. He also finds a diary, and it describes the torture that was inflicted on Short before her death. Bucky starts freaking out and has another episode until he's brought out of it by George showing up and tapping him on the shoulder. And then they get into a fight and Bucky kills him. Bucky goes to Detective Neistat and tells him everything, starting with the evidence he suppressed in exchange for sex and ending with the murder he just did. Detective Neistat helps him cover it up by burning the house down with the body inside. He allows the short case to remain open to protect Bucky. Bucky goes home and really thinks about Madeline's confession for a second and realizes that Madeline mentioned her sister had made a phone call to the police, but that phone call had never been noted anywhere in any of the files. He guesses that it was Lee who got the phone call and that was why Lee knew about the lesbian bar even though Bucky had never mentioned it to anybody. So he tracks down the sister and asks her about the phone call, and she apologizes for the picture she drew of him and explains that she was just so mad at her family because of the way they treated her, and she wanted to implicate them in the murder as revenge. But Lee was the one who came knocking and demanded money from Mr. Sprague. And then he came back for more, but Mr. Sprague didn't want to pay him any more money, so Lee beat him up. And that was the day that Bucky called Madeline for sex, and she told him he couldn't come over because Mr. Sprague had guests over, and also the day that Nash died and Bucky beat Lee up. A woman the sister didn't know came by to pick up the money Mr. Sprague agreed to give Lee after his ass-kicking, and Bucky shows her a picture of Kay from Miss Wallet, and she's like, yep, that's her. Also, Bucky's like, why did you hate your father so much? Was it because he molested you like he did Madeline? And the sister is like, no, I hated him because he didn't molest me. Which, this book is just so much, all the time. Bucky goes to confront Kay about what he just found out, and she's like, yeah, I've known for years who killed Elizabeth Short, but I hated her for what her murder investigation did to you and Lee, and I almost told you, but then you started thinking about her when we were having sex, and I decided not to. Because fuck you, that's why. So Bucky goes back to stalking the Spraggs. He notices Madeline notice him and go back to her Black Dahlia roleplay, but he ignores it and continues to sit on the house until the widow he befriended sees him and invites him over for coffee. They talk more about the painting, and she's like, I found out where my husband got it when he bought it for me for my birthday. Turns out Mrs. Sprague sold it to him back in January of 47. And Bucky's like, holy shit, I need to see that receipt right the fuck now. And the widow's like, coming on a little strong, but okay. And she goes to get it, and the handwriting matches the handwriting Bucky saw in the torture journal. So it turns out Mrs. Sprague was the one who killed Elizabeth Short, not George. Bucky goes back to stalking and waits until he's certain that Mrs. Sprague is alone before confronting her. She pulls a gun on him, but he knocks it out of her hand and she gives up immediately. She's like, I only have a couple more years to live because of the lupus, and I would be extremely sad if my daughter found out that I had tortured a woman for 2 days before murdering her. And Bucky's like, fair enough, tell me your life story. So Mrs. Sprague tells him all about her shitty, loveless marriage to Mr. Sprague, and how she had an affair with George because he was nice, and she started poisoning cats and leaving them for George as her way of flirting. And once Mr. Sprague and Madeline set Short up with George, she got so mad that she followed after and attacked Short, and convinced George to help her dispose of the body in exchange for letting him keep some of the organs. And Bucky's like, were you the one throwing dead cats into graveyards? Remember that little plot point? I sure didn't. Mrs. Sprague is like, I just wanted to let George know that I still loved him. So Bucky leaves and isn't sure if he should come forward with what he knows now because the Spraggs have money and influence and Bucky isn't exactly in a great position given all of the crimes he's been doing. Plus, the sister would find out about what her mom did and we can't have that. Without any better ideas, Bucky goes back to stalking Madeline. He follows her to a bar and then to a motel when she picks up a guy and just hangs out outside of the open window listening to them fuck and talk. Madeline starts out by being like, I have this stepdad who isn't my real dad, so it's not gross. And he is my sugar daddy and doesn't mind when I sleep with other men. But I didn't like my last boyfriend who is a cop and a coward and also sucks. But anyway, I'm going to start doing a Mexican accent now and confess to murdering Lee with an axe. And Madeline either knows that Bucky is there or just does this every time, just in case. Anyway, the soldier is like, okay, this isn't what I signed up for, and leaves, which is smart, because at this point, Bucky is pointing a gun through the window and is about to shoot Madeline, but he decides to change his mind at the last minute and fires the gun into the air, which isn't dangerous at all. and he gets her arrested for Lee's murder. Madeline is like, "Motherfucker, you are going down with this ship," and tells the police that she and Lee and Bucky were in like a love triangle together, and the reason Bucky beat Lee up way back when was because he was fighting for her affections or something. And Bucky doesn't dispute it because explaining the whole book would be tedious and unpleasant. So Madeline goes to a psychiatric facility because she has schizophrenia, apparently, but not before she sells Bucky all the way out to the tabloids and tells the papers how he used to come over and have sex with her while on duty, and he used to steal her dad's liquor to get through the day. Bucky gets fired from the police force and is a car salesman for a while until he gets a letter from Kay, who is like, "I went home to Massachusetts, and I feel bad about how we ended things, but I have no idea if you're still living in the house." And then he gets a second letter the next week like, "I'm in Boston now, I visited a diner, and I met a nice man who met you. Anyway, I'm pregnant, and it's yours." So Bucky gets on a plane and flies out to Boston, and that's how the book ends. Alright, so that happened. Okay, so, I have something of a confession to make. I like to listen to audiobooks while I'm at work, and I enjoy true crime stories. So I thought I would grab a true crime novel about the Elizabeth Short murder, which is a weird blind spot that I have in my true crime knowledge. I don't know why, I just never really learned much about that case. So I went into my library app and typed in The Black Dahlia, and I rented the first book I saw without reading the description, and I assumed that would be what I wanted. Obviously, it was not. Would I have liked this book more if I had known going in that it would be a historical fiction novel loosely based on the murder of Elizabeth Short? Probably not. There isn't much fun to be had in this book. All of the characters were pretty shitty people without much in the way of redeeming qualities, and most of them felt to me as being very flat characters, more like cardboard cutouts than people. But the cardboard is all moldy and the pictures are faded, and honestly, you should just throw it away. It is stinking up the living room, James. But the existence of this book begs an interesting question. Elizabeth Short was a real human person who was murdered, and should we create works of fiction that heavily feature very real tragedies that happened to very real people? Well, this is just how I feel about it, and you're welcome to disagree with me. I think it is fine to use real-life events as inspiration or even write about those events, so long as a sufficient period of time has passed. Like, nobody is getting up in arms about dramatizing the murder of Lincoln. But remember back in 2019 when Yeek came out and everyone was all upset about it because it was heavily inspired by the Eliza Lamb case? I can see why some people would have been iffier on that one, because Eliza Lamb died in 2013, and Yeek came out in 2019, so the wound was still pretty fresh. I don't know where exactly the line is, and I don't know if it's the sort of thing where you can put a hard number on it. I can't say that 5 years is the cutoff point or whatever. I don't think that's how that works. But I think that this 75-year-old murder case passes the sniff test. Even if it didn't, it's not as though James Ellroy used very many verifiable facts from the case in this book. Most of what he presented as true in the book was in fact unsubstantiated rumors or directly contradicted by actual evidence. For instance, the cigarette burns that were mentioned in the book are not mentioned anywhere in Short's real-life autopsy report. And as far as her being a compulsive liar and part-time sex worker, there are as many rumors about what Short was like when she was alive as there are people who are telling them. People have also described her as frigid and prudish, and even James Ellroy admitted that the porn tape in the book was a total fabrication. So if he was so disinterested in using the facts about the actual Short case in this book, why not just make up a totally new murder and write about that? He could have even used some of the same elements from the Short case that he found interesting. Law and Order writers do that pretty much every week. It's not like detective fiction isn't a popular genre. Well, my first instinct is to cynically assume it was for marketing purposes. There's some real name recognition with the Black Dahlia, one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history. Plus, there are dummies like me who might pick up the book thinking they're getting a factual account of the Short murder. But then, I read the Afterword. The Afterword is long and exactly as too much as the rest of the book is. It details the author's relationship with his mother, who was raped and murdered when he was a very small child, as well as the fixation he had developed about Elizabeth Short as a child. He admits to becoming sexually attracted to his mother as he grew older and redirecting that lust towards Elizabeth Short, and how he broke into women's rooms to sniff their underwear. And man, if I had a nickel for every time that happens in a book I've read for this channel, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. I really don't want that to become my brand. Anyway, the Afterword is far too much for me to want to unpack, and honestly, I don't know what to do with any of this information now that I have it. I'm not interested in condemning James Ellroy for using fiction to work through his mommy issues. I do, however, think that it would be better to bring these things up with your therapist rather than anyone who might accidentally read the very famous book that you wrote that has a movie adaptation. No, I will not be watching this movie. I've had quite enough of the adventures of Bucky Blikard, thank you very much. Well, thanks for sitting through all that with me. I promise to do something nicer next month, if only to wash the taste of all that out of my mouth. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like button. And if you want to see more of these, feel free to hit the subscribe button. And the bell, which apparently will alert you when I post a video. I had assumed that was what the subscribe button was for, but apparently I was wrong. I am also on Patreon if you really liked my video, patreon.com/Intergy. And if you want to hear more of my voice, but over me doing a bad job at video games, check me out on twitch.tv/Intergy where I stream on Fridays and at like 1 in the morning on Sundays. Links are in the description.